section of the workbook. It's huge. Let's just start with a very general question. So after you have read the material on the 5 faith paths, and then of course the work you did on, sort of fitting science of mind into that same kind of matrix, what are your thoughts? What are your reactions? Some of you maybe have experience from the various faith paths for whatever reason, and for some of you that might have been, some of that information might have been fairly new. So let's just open it up broadly, and what are your thoughts? What are your reactions? What are your questions?
So for me, I'm proud what we learned, what we've been studying, that God is all there is, that we're all inclusive, that, we don't judge and separate ourselves from everyone else. And frankly, I'm very proud of that.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Other thoughts? Linda.
Well, I found it very informative. I never attended a whole lot of religious churches and whatnot when I was younger, just ones that I could sneak out to. And so for me, this was kind of informative, and to notice where a lot of the commonality was in some of them, and realizing that why a lot of the Sunday schools didn't resonate with me when I was younger is because there seemed to be at that time, a judgmental piece to it. So I found this very interesting.
Well, and you bring up, or what you just said made me think of something. So some of you may not have this perspective, because all of your contact with science of mind may be from a particular center or a particular minister or whatever. If you have the opportunity, or as you have the opportunity to see different centers and different ministers, and of course Linda knows this, and Katie and Linda and I were sort of talking about that while you guys were off in your discussion group, you may see over time, and you may, I don't know, you might get you won't get a sense of it at retreat, at the graduation thing, I doubt. But even within Science of Mind and Spirit, right? This is what we teach. We got, a couple of books that we teach from, and Ernest Holmes, we got one guy. Oh my gosh, there's a wide range of interpretation and emphasis on what's important and how it's presented. I mean, if depending on, you could very easily have 2 individuals, 2 ministers who have radically different interpretations of Holmes's work. Then you get different interpretations of God or the divine from completely different cultures and faith paths. And wow, is it any wonder that we have such diversity? Well, let's continue this conversation and throw into it. So how do you think this impacts you, or could impact you, could show up for you as a practitioner?
We've got a few hands up. Rebecca, Kathy, Teresa.
Yeah, and Linda, why don't you go ahead and call them, because I can't see. Since I'm not
okay. I'll make you the co-host. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. So Teresa, I don't know who was first, but Teresa, go ahead.
I loved the pages on the different religions, because it was so condensed and so easy to understand. And I learned so much, especially about the Islam. And, I've got all this, they're horrible people. And, Sharia law is kind of freaky, but, their philosophies are so similar to all of the other major religions. And it was really great for me to see, like, the 5 pillars. It's 5 pillars, not 5 virgins that you find in, you always hear that, 5 virgins in heaven. No, it's not 5 virgins. And anyway, it was just so enlightening. I love what they said about Judaism. You think you know these things, and then you see it all condensed. It's just fantastic. I just loved how I could really so see that common thread. And anyway, as a practitioner, absolutely. It's so important to know how other people are perceiving what we are, or what they are through their religion. Just fantastic. I loved this reading.
Excellent, cool. Now, and having, before calling someone else, again, what you just said brings something up in me. Do keep in mind that while the material you've been presented in the workbook it's wonderful, it's concise, and in many ways is accurate, it's an accurate slice. There's a great book, for those of you who may be interested in Islam, great book. I don't know who wrote it, but it's called Destiny Interrupted. If you're intrigued at all by Islam, and it's a great, not view, it's the history of the world, as it were, told through the Islamic narrative, whereas we're often presented with the history of the world through a predominantly Christian narrative. Fascinating book, and you will see how it's everything from a very progressive interpretation to a very fundamentalist, conservative, convert or die, convert or kill. And so again, once again, a faith path that has a full range of expression, like every faith path. Even, this blew me away. I mean, Buddhism, right? We think of Buddhism, very new thought, very, very peaceful, I'm sorry, I've forgotten where it is. There is, I don't know if it's a country or a region, and again, my apologies that I can't remember, where the Buddhists, quote unquote, the Buddhist residents, inhabitants of this area, are exterminating the Muslim inhabitants. Now, when I heard that, I came across this about 6 months ago. I was like, what? Buddhists? Buddha? And that just shows my own naivete and my own, how I had framed Buddhism in a particular way. I had my view from what I had been exposed and how I chose to see Buddhism, and it's bigger than that. No matter what faith path we're talking about, these are still people. No matter who you are, what faith path you're following, you're still a person we have all our biases, we have all our pettiness, our hatreds, all of it. And just because you're walking a certain faith path, that does not necessarily mean that it has suddenly been wrung from you and you've dealt with all your thing. I would say this also, and again, then I'll start calling on other people. It has been my experience and is aligned with my understanding that regardless of regardless of the particular faith path one walks, there does seem to be a convergence that as one gets deeper into, and I have to qualify this because there's a lot of variables, but as one evolves and matures in their faith path, there does seem to be more and more of a commonality. As one listens to what I would call the enlightened sages on various paths, the more they do seem to be saying the same thing.
I would add, Simon, that what I think you're referring to is the more mystical aspects. If you look at Judaism and the Kabbalah, you look at Islam, and you look at Sufism, and you look at the mystical contemplative Christianity. Each of those has their mystical paths and aspect, and so I would concur with Simon around that.
Yeah, cool. All right, let's see, Kathy.
So I thought it was a really good representation, information about at least the 5 basic, religions out there. And one thing that I'm doing is there's this, it's actually held at a Presbyterian church, and it's every other Sunday. They have this thing, it's called the Open Table. And they gather, they have different speakers. Like, for instance, like even on like Monday, Thursday, we got together for a meal, and we had a meal with a group of Islamic people on Holy Thursday. And then but they do different talks each time. And one time they had a theologian that teaches at the Baptist seminary. And I was like, okay, I remain open for this one. But he did a talk on, did God kill Jesus? And then, so you have you share a meal together, which is sort of potluck. And then you get to know people at your table. A person talks, and then you have a group discussion. And it's a variety of different people from different religions that end up showing up. And it's really an amazing way to have talks like that and get to know people and, share a conversation that you wouldn't probably on a regular basis do.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Good Friday they did they did a walk in sort of like a poorer part of town to represent the Stations of the Cross, so to speak.
Interesting.
And like what would Jesus be like now in today's society?
Very cool.
Yeah.
Rebecca.
So you had asked how we can use this information as practitioners, and I wanted to share my own experience. A lot of people come to religious science running away from the religion, and it's kind of a joke sometimes among practitioners and ministers. I don't know if you've run into it, but it's like if you grew up in the Christian church and you've decided to turn your back on that and you're in religion, it's very easy to be critical of what you grew up in, or whatever that is. But what's interesting, if you travel around and visit other Science of Mind centers, and I've had the great opportunity to have some traveling opportunities, and there were also 2 centers in Pittsburgh at one time. They're all very different and diverse, and they're not all. It's not a uniform. Science of Mind is not a uniform teaching, and you're going to find centers that you really resonate with. And I visited one in Virginia that was what I would classify as strange. They were lovely people, very nice people, but it was a very odd service. And had I stumbled into that as my first Science of Mind experience, I can tell you I wouldn't be here today. There's another one in Rhode Island that was very much like almost like an evangelical Protestant service. I felt very comfortable there. The people were also very warm and wonderful. I probably would have stayed with Science of Mind had I gone there because of the people and the atmosphere and all of those very different from the 2 different experiences I had here. And what really struck me, I'm kind of a student of religion, so I'm understand and curious about world religions and have practiced a few throughout my life. So what's interesting to me is that what you, Reverend Simon, alluded to, at the core root of all of this is people. And there are good people in Science of Mind, and there are good people in Judaism, and there are people in Islam. And there are some jackasses in every one of those religions, including Science of Mind. And I think as practitioners, what we really can bring to the world, number 1, don't be a jackass if you're going to be a practitioner. That's my first rule. My second rule would be is to remember that people, we all struggle with things, and sometimes we're better versions of ourselves than others. And if we can remember that about all these different religions and remember that about ourselves and kind of shine that light, I mean, that really is the best gift that as practitioners we can give to the world. There's a lot of fighting. More people have been killed across history because of religion than anything. And I think there's great opportunity for us as practitioners to follow those 2 Rebecca's rules, if you will. Just my 2 cents.
Very cool.
Just make sure you don't say that in your licensing panel.
Actually, I was going to say, if you can fit it on your written test somewhere, I'll give you I was gonna. I'll buy you a beer, but then again, we're back to the whole beer thing, and who knows? Oh, that would be so funny.
I
And
would
by
just
the
blame
way,
it on being a sailor. I would just be like, yeah, hey, what are you going to do, right? So
very cool. Laverne.
What I wanted to say is that I used to have a fear of people from a lot of different religions because, when I grew up, a lot of people talked about you can't do this, you can't do that, and if you get involved in this, you might get yourself hurt, and a lot of different things. So the first time I went to the Middle East, I was really nervous about going there and going out and wondering what people would want to do. And I stayed right across the street from a mosque. And every morning they had their call to prayer. It was just so beautiful. By the end of my trip, I didn't want to leave because I didn't want to miss the call to prayer. It raises your consciousness. It makes you feel, just meditate on God all day and the goodness. So, so I go back, I went last year, I'm getting ready to go back this year. Not just for that reason, my daughter lives there, but every time I go, I try to go to some area where I can hear the call to prayer. It makes me want to pray more myself.
Very cool. Very cool. Sue Ellen.
I was going to share something different, but after Laverne's share, I have something else. I went to Egypt about 15 years ago, and it is one of the most vivid memories in my mind. And I got to actually participate in a Ramadan party, and I talked to people, from that part of the world, and I say, well, it's sort of like Mardi Gras with no alcohol. And I remember there was a tour guide, taking us to these mosques and really talking about how Islam works. And I just remember thinking, wow, there's so many similarities between that and Christianity. And why are we making such a big deal about the differences? And it was just such a rich, incredible experience. And also, I was living abroad at the time, and I was getting kind of bored with Europe, let's say. And I just remember going there. It was so different and so alive. And it was, again, also hearing the call to prayer and seeing men praying on the sidewalk. It was just fascinating to me. And, they celebrated on a different day, and it was all really eye-opening and beautiful. So that's my completion of my share.
Very cool. Thank you. Marcia.
Even before we did this reading, and maybe even before I found Science of Mind, I was figuring out why are there so many religions in the world. And I think it's because within our bodies, we hear God in different ways. And so there are so many religions so that God can be heard everywhere.
I can buy it. So then why is there so much, do you think? I know this is, I'm making a very complex thing simplistic, but what do you think is at the heart of why so often individuals from different faith paths clash? What do you think? I mean, yeah, we could say, well, difference of opinion, but go deeper than that. Sarah, and then Sharon.
This is a really interesting subject for me because I grew up in a very multicultural family. In my family, we have Islam, we have Catholicism, we have Judaism. There's all these different threads going on, with Islam probably being the dominant thing numerically. And as a child, I was raised with a little bit of everything, and it did seem like they were all clashing all the time. Everybody was saying my way is the right way, and this is what you have to do. As a child, they were instructing me in this and saying, and you can't do any of the other ways because this is all wrong. But what I could see from my perspective is the common threads. They had different ways of saying exactly the same thing. And to me, it just looked like a product of different cultures and different geography, different history. My family is from all over the world. We speak 4 languages. That's what I think it is. I just think that they're seeing the same light, but through a different lens.
Very cool. Cool. Sharon.
So, my stab at your question, the first thing that came up was fear. And when you have a religion that's based on an afterlife of reward and punishment, then you want to try and save everybody, and so you have to think that my way is the way that I'm going to get rewarded, and I need to get you all on board. Because if there's a possibility that they're not the right one, then there's all this fear about what happens. And so I think it's really all fear. You know, for me, anytime I go into control in my life, it's because I'm afraid of something, and so I need to grab onto it and make it go my way. And I think that is kind of historically what has happened in religion, is that fear that, you know, when we die, there's this prescribed path to heaven, and if you don't take this path, you won't get there. And so that's the recruitment part of it, is let's get everybody on board. And then, you know, and then you start getting the Protestant idea comes in, and it's like, well, God's already predetermined all this stuff, and then it gets even weirder. But I think it all comes down to fear, you know, of the uncertainty of the afterlife and what happens after, and, you know, wanting that path to the reward and excluding everybody else.
Right. Okay, cool. Now, before I comment on that, let me see what Alexandra has to say.
So I have two things to say. One, I think, is cultural. And just like in every culture, we eat certain foods, we have certain practices, we use certain language and certain vocabulary. It's a tribal thing. And if you're from another tribe, you know, you just don't belong. And so people tend, the law of attraction, everybody flocks to people that are like them, and they find themselves much more comfortable with people that believe as they do, and they speak the same language, whether that's English or Christianese or, you know, religious science. I mean, we all have our own little idioms and our own little faiths. And the other thing I was going to say is, even though the majority of these faiths, all of them really are monotheistic, it's like my God is better than your God. You know, my God is the true God. As if there's this is amazing to me, as if there's a bunch of them sitting over there, and you're going, not you, not you, not you, this guy, and you're putting, and then they feel compelled to defend their God as being the greatest God, and that's, you know, how people end up at odds with each other. And I find that amazing. I go to church sometimes with my husband. There's a community Christian church here in San Carlos, and all the songs, you know, my God and our God is, you know, victory over who, you know, over other gods, over other people. It's just interesting. I go back to the fact that I think it's tribal.
Mm-hmm. And so I would add on that then, because that's, you know, definitely why they're different. And I think Sharon really addresses it, is that, you know, our faith paths are so much based on faith, right? We don't necessarily have concrete evidence. We have a variety of beliefs that, for a variety of reasons, our individual experience and how we were brought up and what calls to us, you know, we have found this faith path, and we say, wow, this feels right to me. And yes, I do believe that, you know, God is one, and I do believe that God is experience. So these things feel right to us. And so we've all sort of collectively agreed. But prove it. I can't prove these things we're teaching to you in this class. I can say, well, I have a deep knowing. And I can say, well, you know, I've had these intuitive experiences, and maybe I've even had mystical experiences. Well, how do I know? It just wasn't a bunch of neurotransmitters that were going a little haywire, and I had this great connection of oneness, and that just wasn't something that was happening in my brain. So we do follow these paths on faith and on feeling. And then, especially like within Science of Mind, we take steps to prove these principles, right? To validate them in our own lives. Now, if on my faith path, it becomes contingent upon my belief if you then say things and present me with beliefs which potentially threaten my belief, in other words, where I'm sitting there going, well, no, wait a minute, both of those can't be true, right? I mean, we don't teach that we're bodily resurrected and we will go to this place called heaven, and there we will spend the rest of eternity, whatever, either floating on the clouds or with our loved ones or, those who made the cut or whatever. But wait a minute, you over here, that's what you believe. Well, we can't both be right. So which one of us is right? And why do I think? Now, suddenly, if I desire to believe that, well, I'm right, of course I'm right, otherwise I wouldn't be believing this, then whether I come out or the degree to which I express it, there is a tendency for there to be some part of me that says, well, you're wrong. I may not, again, I'm not come out and say that, or I may not act that way, and even we as religious scientists, we have to be careful about how we hold our beliefs. For instance, in Islam, and again, I'm generalizing here, but in Islam, very clear that God and God's creation are separate. This is not really debatable. This is one of the fundamental pieces. God is separate from God's creation. And there are countries, there are areas that if you were in and you implied that God was one, if you shared our philosophies, you would likely be killed. Period. End of story. Does that mean they're wrong? Does that mean we're wrong? How do you do this dance? And I guess I would suggest to you, then we'll open it up for more conversation. There is a place perhaps at which you stop, and internally you just go, well, let's just agree to disagree. And we'll just be in that place of not having to be right, but knowing that God is showing up for us in different ways that perhaps are not intellectually or logically compatible, but we will perhaps just rest in the idea that beyond our intellect, somehow there is a compatibility. I'll say one last thing before I open it up. There is a book. It's an interesting book. If this kind of thing fascinates you, let me think. It is called God is Not One. I don't remember who wrote it, but I'm pretty sure that if you Google that or go to Amazon, you'll come out with this. God is Not One. And it's really an excellent book in that the premise is, and I can't remember, the guy's a teacher at one of the universities, a teacher of religions. And so he talks about the different faith paths, and he provides a very good overview of their beliefs, their predominant beliefs, kind of like what you have in the workbook, but more in depth. And he's saying basically, well, look, this faith path predominantly believes this and believes that this, this is the afterlife, this is their view of God, and compare it to this faith path. These two are not compatible. I mean, boom, and that is really the premise of the book. He's making this case that, look, they are not compatible. They both can't be right. Now, the value in it, and the reason I would even recommend it to it, is because there are great, concise descriptions of these different faith paths. Where personally I think he errs is he's simply looking at conditions. He's simply saying, well, yeah, I don't have the time, I don't think, but have I shown you all, or have we posted that image of what's true versus what's truth? Did I show you that? But Sarah, did you see it in this class, or did you see it in another class I taught?
I think I saw that in self-mastery. In fact, I'm sure I did, but I think it may have been shared in term 1 in here as well.
Do other people remember that? It's a little diagram. Okay, and I think I have it. This is worth, because it is so, it has exactly what we're talking about right here. And I think I do have it. Let me just pull it up. And I think you're right, self-mastery. Oh. Yeah, okay. So let me share my screen. Oops, let me get the chat out of it. Can you all see that? Because I don't see the little green thing around my. You see the diagram? So Sarah, nod your head if you see it. Okay, cool. So, imagine that you're this tribe of people who sees the divine this way, right? And God is a blue circle. I mean, this is our experience. Everything we know, everything that our entire worldview is predicated on this belief that God is a blue circle. Are you crazy? Says this other. God is an orange rectangle. What the heck are you talking about? There's nothing. God is all angles and straight lines. No, God is circular. And imagine this argument if this is what one group is experiencing and this is what another group is experiencing. Well, what I'm saying to you is there is a reality, there is a deeper level of understanding where somehow, even though it may be inconceivable to us within human form, that all of these seeming indiscrepancies come together in one. And it could be that if we're down here at the level of human manifestation and the intellect and logical thinking and the perception of duality, it could be that it is impossible at that level for us to reconcile the differences. That indeed they do seem reality-based and irreconcilable. But what I'm telling you, what I'm suggesting you have faith in, and if we believe that God is all there is and God is one, if we really believe that, then what I'm saying, I think, has to be true, that at a deeper or higher level of knowing, that which is perhaps beyond our intellect, that which, as Linda mentioned, perhaps gets more into the mystical experience, there is a reality, there is an understanding in which all seeming opposites, all seeming contradictions and paradoxes do in fact resolve into one. Right, that's all I got. Now I'm going to open it up. And Linda, feel free to jump in and share. But I love that diagram because this is what we teach. God is one, but well, wait a minute. What about this? What about good and evil? What about good and evil? And how can they? It may be that we can't talk about it, but rest assured that there is a deeper level of revelation and understanding where all opposites, all contradictions are resolved into one. If that's what we teach and that's what we believe, then as far as my ability to process logic, that has to be the case, even though I can't necessarily articulate to you what that is. Okay.
And, I think this is so important for us as practitioners to educate ourselves, to be, somewhat versed in, not in necessarily in depth about everything, but enough so that we can meet people. That's one of my big things. We meet people where they are. And if we can meet people where they are, then there can possibly be an invitation for them to be interested in what we might have to share. If we're resisting who they are, what they stand for, there's likely not going to be that interest and that curiosity, which was mentioned earlier. And I've seen this, so much in my life that as I have also traveled around to many, not only religious science communities, but many different kinds of religious and spiritual communities. As a yoga teacher, I lived in an ashram and spent many years, involved with yoga communities. But the most profound experience I can remember that just was so emblematic for me at a young age is when I was, during my high school years, my family moved from where we lived in the city of Chicago to a suburbs, and my best friend, her father was a doctor, a thoracic surgeon at a hospital that was connected to a religious organization. And every midnight mass, there I was. We went there, and it was part of what he had to do. They were Jewish, just like my family was, but as a member of the staff there, he was head of that, whatever his department was, he was, sort of obliged to go. And to me, my parents were like, whatever, it's on, if you're going with Ellen's father, it's fine, even though they didn't want to know about it. But I knew at that time that whatever they were saying and doing, I felt that we were all trying to figure out the same thing. We were all trying to find out what the meaning of our life is, and to give and to find, you know, assign meaning to our life and purpose. And that opened me up to, for years after, I have attended all kinds of religious functions, of people say, oh, my church is having this, or my mosque is, I'd say, oh, I want to go. You know, and I always went with the idea of, I'm going to learn something. I'm going to be more able to be a loving person. So whatever is in our head, you know, the logic, reasoning, whatever, how enculturated we are, wherever our families, you know, no matter how much dogma and how much, you know, was imposed on us, I really believe it comes down to how we show up, you know, and how open we can keep our heart, and what we are an example of, not necessarily religious science, but are we an example of a loving consciousness? Are we an example of someone whose heart is open, who can be supportive, a supportive presence of whatever is going on, who can appreciate whoever is before us, who can honor and respect whatever path, whatever way anybody is finding God and finding meaning in their life. And that is why, to this day, I feel comfortable anywhere, everywhere, in a mosque, in a temple, in a synagogue. I don't feel threatened. I don't feel like someone's going to try to convince me of something else against my will. And I don't feel like I have to prove anything to anyone. I know what my, as we talked about earlier in the last terms, my values are. And that's who I show up as. And I think that says everything, more than what even religious science is about.
Yeah. Rebecca, you had your hand up.
There's a wonderful Hindu teacher in London who, his name is Jay Lakhani, and he's wonderful at teaching the basics of Hinduism to young people. And his mission is to kind of encourage dialogue among different religious people. And he tells a story whenever really religious Hindus challenge him. He tells this story about two young boys who are in the play yard, they're playing football, and one boy begins to taunt the other boy and say, my mummy's better than your mummy. And the other boy gets indignant and says, what are you talking about? My mummy's the best. She makes the best cakes. She's the best cook in the town. He says, what, are you kidding me? The last time I had your mother's cookies, I almost broke a tooth. And they begin to fight over whose mother is the best mummy. And a stranger comes along and sees these two boys fighting, and he separates them. And he says, what's the issue? And they tell him, you know, well, my mommy's the best. And the other one says, no, his mummy's not. My mummy's the best. And so they're having this argument. And the wise stranger says, well, your mother is certainly the best for you. And he says, in religion, if we can remember, like these schoolboys, that the religion we choose is the best for us, we don't have to force, you know, in the same way you think about it, like these two young boys, the mother was the best for each child. It wasn't something that you would want to impose one on the other. And he uses that example to talk about how important it is to understand that, you know, Christianity, evangelical Christianity, as many issues as I may have with that, it works for some people. It's the best for some people. And I love that story because I don't know, the way he told it was probably much better than I'm sharing it, but it really made sense to me. It resonated, and I just wanted to share that with the group.
That's beautiful. And before I forget, if you want to celebrate religion from all over the world, come with me and Simon to Toronto in November to the Parliament of World Religions, November 1st through the 7th. I was in Salt Lake City for the last one in 2015, and it changed. I mean, I'm a different person because there's 10,000 people there. You're like in a mini world there, experiencing everything in different religions, lectures and dancing and foods. And I tell everybody I know, don't miss it. It's November 1st through the 7th. The early bird registration is passed, but it's no matter how much it costs now, because it's probably going to be on the other side of the world. You know, it's in Toronto this year. It was in Salt Lake City 3 years ago. Before that, it was in Melbourne and Barcelona. So check it out.
Yeah, and you know, in a very simplistic sense, I mean, think of the analogy of, you know, a journey, taking a journey and someone's experience along that. So here I am walking through the desert, and I have definitely a perspective, a worldview, and then here another person is walking in a very tropical area, and then another person in an Arctic area, another person in an urban area, and they have a certain worldview. They have a certain perspective, and they have all the things that would go along, you know, in this case with the culture and the habits and the traditions. And it's a piece. It's a piece of what it is in this analogy to be a human on the planet Earth. Likewise, our faith paths are pieces. They're perspectives of this thing, this absolute thing we call the divine. And those can be, you know, someone who's living in the Sahara and has their perspective, and someone who's living up in, you know, the north side of Mount Denali in Alaska, they're going to have two radically different experiences. And if you tried to get them, well, no, this is what life is like. Are you crazy? You know, this is what life is like. Well, why should it startle us at all that we would have these same conversations around the absolute creative force, process, consciousness, intelligence behind the all of it? Of course we'll have different perspectives, not because God is limited, but because our perspective is presumably limited. We see and experience but a piece, a sliver of the absolute, of the divine. And we get into trouble when we start to say, no, our two pieces seem contradictory. They seem mutually exclusive. Therefore, one of us must be wrong. And of course, it's probably you, because, hello, I know what I'm doing. We really have to get to that place of, I don't understand how my world, it's 120 degrees every day, and your world, it's below 30, and I don't even know what snow is. But you know what? I'm just gonna set aside the need to be right and hold on to this belief that somehow, in some reality, those two things are both possible. So as you meet people, it'll be interesting. Like, what would happen if you met with someone and they said, well, hey, come on, when we do this prayer thing, I understand you're going to pray at the end. Could you use Jesus? Could you say Jesus? Or they come to you and say, I am really uncomfortable with the word God. Can you? Now for us, we might be, well, that's fine. I'll use spirit. I'll use whatever. But, you know, you may get people who come to you, especially if you live in, you know, diverse communities, who are asking or wanting you to do something, and you will, as you get your experience, you will have, you know, there could be that you sit with a client, and just like any other issue where you're like, you know what, I hear your request, you know, for instance, if you suddenly want me to pray to, you know, oh Jesus, you know, look upon this sinner, and you know, you're like, you know, I'm sorry, I don't pray that way. I will be happy to hold you in consciousness. You know, here's what I do. But you may have to wrestle with these questions as people come to you. You may have someone who's very, you know, condemning, and well, this person, and you know, you're going to have to just be open to that. Linda, you've got
what I want to say about that, because I've been with thousands of clients over the years, and everything from fundamental Christians to every religion and every background, is that, guess what? I met them where they were. And if they were into Christ consciousness, I could get into Christ consciousness with them. And I could say, I mean, I have never found the need to say anything or pray a certain way that I wasn't aligned with. Because guess what? because science of mind is based on universal principles, they can be they can be explained in a way that anyone can understand them, regardless of their religious or spiritual path. It's like gravity. You know, you can explain something in the same way you could explain gravity to someone, and it would make sense, because that's why I love about these teachings so much. Not only do they incorporate all the great truths of all paths, but they're also very practical. I've never had anyone say to me, "Oh, I don't understand, you know, how what I do creates my reality. Choices I make result in something." No one's ever said they don't understand that. Everybody gets, you know, consequences. And so the basis, the most important aspects of this teaching, everybody can understand them if you know how to explain them. And when you're with them, I find the language, I hear them speak, and I use their language so they can hear me. And you will learn how to do that too.
I just have to say, my teenage daughter doesn't quite get the consequences thing. She's working on
No, she gets it. She just doesn't like it.
No, I think she actually doesn't get it. But anyway, hey, I got something to suggest. How about we break into small groups? I think it would be good if we took like 10 minutes or so. And what I'd love you guys to talk about is your faith path, you know, what you have experienced and what you've been brought up with. But more importantly, because we're not going to take a lot of time doing it, are you aware of areas where you might have a bias? Are you aware of areas where you might struggle? If you had someone come to you and, they held a particular view, or, their worldview or their God view or their view of others, their view of sin, are you aware of biases that you might have or that you're currently working on? Have a dialogue around that. I know it's easier for us to say, no, I'm totally loving and accepting. I accept all people. And that's great, if that's totally where you're at. So anyway, and Linda, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, Rebecca has her hand up.
Oh, Rebecca.
No, that was from before. Okay.
Okay.
No, that's great.
Yeah, okay. So let's do that. Linda, we'll have to break you into groups. I don't know. What do you think? Groups of 4, 3 to 4?
Yeah.
And
sure.
give them like 12-ish minutes.
Sounds
That
good.
gives each person 3 to 4 minutes.
Yep, I'm going in. Hold on.
So around this, where do you think you might struggle? Where do you, if you were sitting with a client who hold very different views from you, where might your growth still need to occur? What might trigger or challenge you?
Simon, are we not going to do these questions that we created?
No, we're not going to go through them like, one by one, but hopefully they will inform our conversation. And 2, hopefully it was a valuable practice for you to do. I'm not joking.
Oh, good. It was. Maybe we can use it. Maybe we can use it for future quizzes.
Okay, here we go.
Cool.
Okay, I'm going to move Laverne. Let's see. Oh, wait, let's see. Where is Lan? Kathy, Deborah, Sarah.